駐日英国大使館、それから政策研究大学院大学共催のシンポジウム、緊急事態における科学者の情報発信ということで、この重要なテーマについて今日はシンポジウムを開催したいと思います。開会に先立ちましていくつかお願いをさせていただきます。今日実はですね、たくさんの方にご応募いただきまして、もう席がですねいっぱいになって何人かもすでにお断りをしている状態ですので、ぜひ奥の方から皆さん詰めてお座りいただければと思います。それからもう当たり前でございますけれども携帯電話オフにしていただければと思っております。それから今日は同時通訳が入っておりますのでご質問等される場合は必ずマイクを使っていただきたいと思います。それからアンケートを配らせていただいておりますので、お帰りの際にはそのアンケート用紙ご記入の上スタッフにお渡しいただければと思います。それから最後にですね、今日たくさんの報道関係者の方もいらしておりますけれども、写真撮影等は報道関係者のみのようにさせていただいておりますので、よろしくお願いいたします。申し遅れましたが本日の進行役を務めさせていただきます政策研究大学院大学で科学技術イノベーションプログラムを担当しております須波と言います。よろしくお願いいたします。それでは基調講演に先立ちまして来賓のご挨拶をいただきたいと思います。ベディントン博士の、いわゆる我が国のカウンターパートということで、総合開発会議議員ではの相沢先生の方から一言よろしくお願いいたします。
大変幸運なことに本日グリプスとそれから英国の大使館の主催によりましてベディントン科学顧問の講演をいただくことができました。実は4月の18日に私はベディントン科学顧問とテレビの会議をやりました。でその時にどういうことを話したかというと、まずですね、今回の大震災において英国の方々からですね非常に心温かなメッセージご支援これをいただいておりました。そこでそのお礼です。その次に大変な私の思いを込めて申し上げたことは、ベディントン顧問が、東京におられる英国の方々、この方々にですね大変適切なアドバイスを出しておられた。でこれは電話によるコミュニケーションなんですけれども、まだ福島第一原発の事故の状況が安定化してない極めて危機の状態であります。その時に日本の政府は30キロということを避難圏内という形に指定したわけですが、その指示が適切であるということを丁寧に英国民の方々に説明されました。でこのことが非常に効果的に働きまして、不安の状態であったと思われる方々に安堵感を与えて、その後の推移を見守るような形になりました。大震災は地震、津波、そして原発事故、さらにですね風評被害ということで四重の災禍が襲ってきたわけであります。でこの風評被害ということは大変扱いにくい事項でありまして、このことに対して英国は非常にいいリスクコミュニケーションというものを社会との間の形にですね仕組みとして作られてきている。でそのリードをされてきたのがベディントン科学顧問であります。で本日は我々の社会にはなかなかその仕組みができておらない、リスクコミュニケーションを中心にですねいろいろなアドバイスをいただけるのではないかということで、私も本日お話を伺い大いに日本のためにこれを生かすように活用させていただきたいというふうに思っております。どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。
それでは早速基調講演の方に移らせていただきたいと思います。ご登壇いただければと思います。 本日はモデレーターにですね、大変ご多忙の中大変皆さんも著名の、ご存知だと思いますが、池上彰さんにお願いをしております。じゃあ準備が、じゃあ池上さんよろしくお願いいたします。
ご紹介いただきました池上です。本日はやはりリスクコミュニケーションが中心になるんだろうと思うんですね。今回のような非常事態が起きたときに、政治家の多くも、あるいは行政も、そして多くのマスコミも、そして一般国民も何が何だかよくわからない、そもそもよくわからないから不安だという、状況に陥ったわけですね。その時に科学者は何ができるんだろうか、一般国民に対して何を言えるのか、あるいは政府に対して、役所に対してどのようなアドバイスができるのかという点においても多くの課題を残したと考えています。そこで今日はその点において非常に先進的な取り組みをしています、イギリスのからサー・ジョン・ベディントン英国政府首席科学顧問をお呼びしてお話を聞くことができます。こちらはイギリスのデビッド・キャメロン首相の直属の科学者、科学顧問というお立場でありまして、何か緊急事態があったときにはですね、専門家を直ちに招集してどうすればいいのかということを検討し、それをいち早く国民に伝える、指示をする、アドバイスをするという仕組みがあります。それがどのような仕組みなのかというお話を伺います。そして今もお話がありましたように、今回の場合は日本にいるイギリス国民に対してさまざまなアドバイスをしています。そして駐日英国大使館のホームページでイギリス国民向けのメッセージ、あるいは今回の事態についての懇切丁寧な説明が掲載されました。実は私もそれを読んでおりました。これからそういう教訓をどのように生かしていったらいいのか、それをこれから考えていこうと思います。まずベディントン教授から25分ほどお話をいただきます。そしてその後会場からの質問を、私がそれをとりあえずお話を質問を聞いてそれに対してお答えをいただくという形を取りたいと思っております。先ほどそういうふうにやりますのでと申し上げましたら、フレンドリーでイージーな質問にしてほしいという、ご注文がありましたので、私としてはいい質問ですねと言われるような質問を申し上げたいと、お答えをいたしましたが、この様子はユーストリームでも中継されておりまして、それをご覧になっている方からのツイッターでの質問というのも受け付けます。では、ついついお顔を見るとですね、パディントンさんと間違って言いたくなってしまうので大変失礼いたしました。サー・ジョン・ベディントン、顧問教授から、まずはプレゼンテーションをお願いします。どうぞ。
皆さんこんにちは。では最初にちょっと真面目にお話し始めたいと思うんですが、もう日本では未曾有の災害が起こっております。一つ重要なことはですね、これイギリスも説明しようとしたんですけども、たくさんの方が亡くなりました津波地震で、そして原子力の問題、そういったその自然災害から亡くなった人のことを考えれば、やはりその原子力災害というのはそれほど大きなものではないと、つまりその社会全体のもすごい災害があったということを申し上げたいと思っております。で、当然その、そういったことを申し上げ出してもですね、私いろんなそのジョークをすることもあります。プレゼンをするときにいろんなそのジョークをするんですけども、だからそういったジョークをするからといって何もその今回の災害を見くびっているわけでもありません。過小評価をしているわけでもありません。 でそういった形で先ほど優しいフランドリーな質問をしてくださいって言いましても、これも一つのジョークなんですけども、つまりこういったスタイルで私プレゼンを行いますので、ご誤解ないようにお願いしたいと思います。まず私の仕事なんですけども、首相の直属になっておりまして、私の責任はまずイギリスのすべての科学的な助言を行うということであります。当然誰一人としてそういったもう知識を持っている人はいませんので、もし持っている人がいたら本当にもうクレイジーな人だと思うんですけども、ところが私はそれをまとめ役としていろんな人を私の配下に置いているということです。例えば非常に幅の広い基盤があるわけで、いろんな問題には幅広い面があるんですけれども、例えばこの一番上の方にですね、日本の原子力問題というのがありますけれども、異常気象気候変動の問題もあります。それからイギリス北ヨーロッパはですね、実際去年だけではなく火山の問題もあったわけであります。で2010年にかけてもこういった問題があるということであります。例えば太陽の活動が活発になって、例えば宇宙の影響も出てくるということ、そういった問題は私どものお皿の中に私の仕事としてあるわけであります。で当然のことはたくさんやらなければならないということで、どのような形でこういったクレイジーな仕事をするのかということなんですけども、私のやり方はまず政府に対して説得をすると。でいわゆる省庁に対してそれぞれの省庁それぞれに科学首席顧問というものがおります。この写真がありますけども、で例えば水曜日の毎週水曜日の朝、我々朝食会を行って、でそういった首席科学顧問との間で朝食会を行って、どういった問題があるのかということを論議するということをしております。で今日の話なんですけども、まず実際に緊急時科学はどういった働きをするのかということであります。基本的にこの緊急時英国政府の対応の仕方なんですが、まず当然科学的なアドバイスが必要だと。当然コミュニティがあるんです。コブラコミュニティとコブラという、このコブラっていうちょっと劇的な蛇のような響きがする名前ですけども、で実際にこれはカビネットオフィスブリーフィングルームということで、何も蛇の名前ではありません。実際これは内閣府のコミュニティなんですけども、このコブラと呼んでおりますけども、でまず首相がキャンベロン首相が招集をするコミュニティでありまして、でまた実際に題材に応じていろんな幹部大臣閣僚が出てくるわけですけども、そこで緊急時の討議をするということであります。でそして実際危機に関して科学的な要因が要求される場合にはですね、やはりまず私が中心となって政治というものを招集いたします。これは緊急時の科学的な緊急提言をするものなんですけども、そういった形で政治ということで報告書を上げて首相に上げるということであります。最近科学技術に関する議会の委員会から報告書が出てきまして、その中でここにもありますような形で科学緊急時にどういうふうにするのかということが論議されました。でその中でやはり議会の要望としては、科学者にそういった議論に参加をしていただきたいということであります。緊急時にはより科学的なアドバイスが必要だということが示されていたわけであります。で実際に政府の決定は何も感情だけではなく、メディアマスコミの言うことだけではなく、また政局絡みだけではなく、当然緊急時の決定っていうのはやはり内容ですね。つまりその中で科学的なアドバイスに基づいて行うということが非常に重要だということになっているわけです。では今度は日本の災害、3月の災害についてお話をしたいと思いますけども、でこれはもう手短に済ませましょう。このページについてはもう皆さん当然やはり難しいいろんな組み合わせがあるんですね。例えば大きな大地震があったと、もう今までは未曾有の大きな地震があって、その次に大きな津波が来たわけであります。もう何百年かなかったような大きな津波が来たわけであります。でそれからその後で起こったことなんですけども、原子力発電所の福島の第一発電所の問題が起きたわけであります。である意味地震の保護はうまくいったと。いろんな、当然情報がたくさん出てくるにつれて検証が必要なんですけども、津波が 実際に全てのその能力を奪い去ってしまったと、原子力発電所の機能を奪ってしまって、で実際にその冷却装置も不具合を起こして、実際に冷却ができなくなってしまったということになって、実際に世界で一番その厄介な問題が起きてきたということになったわけであります。でこれ皆さんよくご存知の写真だと思いますけども、でこれちょっともう詳細を省きますけども、いくつかの問題が実際にここで起こっております。でまず最初に、実際にその煙が出てきて、でそしてそれぞれのその原子炉で問題が起こっていないかということになったわけであります。でそしてその第1号機の爆発が起こって、その建屋が損害を受けたということです。でそういったことが起こった後ですね、で実際に東京電力が発表したんですけども、実際にその一部部分的なメルトダウンがあったということを東電の発表で最近分かったわけであります。でもうこの 2,3 ヶ月ずっとこういった悲劇が起こってきたわけでありまして、皆さんこれもよくご存知のことだと思います。でここで私は何をするのか、私は首相によって何を命令されたのかということでありますけど、まず実際にその首相はさっきのコブラの委員会をイギリスで招集いたしました。そして、そこでその一番高いレベルでのその政策をそこで決めるわけですけども、まずそこで私に首相から依頼があって、政治のグループを招集しなさいという命令がおりました。ですここでの基本的な問題は、実際にそのイギリス人、日本に住んでいるイギリス人を避難させるべきかどうかを考えなさいということなんです。で実際に福島での問題に比べれば、これは我々そのイギリスにいたわけですから、非常にそのたやすい質問ではあったわけです。でそして政治ですね、緊急時のその科学者の提言グループを招集をしました。でそうして実際にその合理的なワーストケースのシナリオですねを科学者と話し合ったわけであります。でそして政府の科学者が詳細を検討して、で同時にドイツ、フランス、それからアメリカの人にもそれから日本の人にもいろいろ連絡を取ったわけであります。でこのコミュニティなんですけども、まずその構成メンバーは多くのその省庁が入っております。で実際にこの問題に関係ある省庁ですね。で左の方にあるのがいろんなその省庁の政府の長所ですね。例えばその内閣府、それぞれの省庁、例えばその安全衛生執行機関とかそんな省庁があって、そして右の方にはですね、原子力研究所、あるいはその他のその政府の省庁、例えばその放射線のモニタリングの部署ですとか、あるいはその原子力の規制機関、検査機関、そういった人たちがここに入っております。例えばその IAEA の人間、ここからも来てますけども、非常にその重要な人たちがメンバーとして入っているわけであります。つまりその緊急時政府がどのような形で対応してアドバイスを出すのかということ、そういったことをするために、例えばその独立的な人
Wakeford, who is an expert on radiation and health, and also our National Nuclear Laboratory is albeit owned by government, does not report directly, the Met Office, and so on. And we also had observers from our Civil Aviation Authority, and because of the way the UK science advice is structured, we also had observers from Scotland, our border agencies, and the industry. So that was the way that we did it. That's how we set it up. And the question, recall, that question is, what should UK nationals do? A very easy question, really. They should move or they shouldn't, is almost the answer. Now, how did we decide on that? Because we're operating at a time when, for obvious reasons, there was enormous amounts of uncertainty in the information that was coming out about what was happening in the plant, and the information that could reasonably be obtained by looking at the international media and so on. So the way we looked at these problems was to ask, what is a reasonable worst case that might happen in this situation? And this is an interesting concept and extremely important, very central to the way that the United Kingdom deals with emergencies. First of all, let's go down what's the reasonable worst case. We already knew that the cooling activities had failed due to the cutting off of power, and what would happen? if cooling couldn't happen, we could look at a failure of the reactor pressure vessels and an explosive reaction called meltdown in the jargon, in which the molten fuel could fall through the bottom of the reactor, interact with the floor, and generate hydrogen and a major buildup of pressure in which radioactive material would be ejected to a very substantial height. Now, very important, this bullet point, because we got very detailed advice about what would be the explosive properties of such an event and how high would the radioactive material go up. And of course we needed to understand how much radioactive material was likely to be in the cores and how much might be released in a worst case from this phenomena. And it's important to compare it, and I almost got tired of doing this comparison by talking to the media, who kept saying it's just like Chernobyl. It was not remotely like Chernobyl. Chernobyl involved an active reactor with a graphite core burning, putting radioactive material up to something of the order of 30,000 feet and burning for many weeks. What we knew, even in this worst case of a reactor meltdown, was that you would see radioactive material put up to 500 meters, but that would only be for an hour or so before that fell back to the ground. And of course, in the reasonable worst case, what that event would have to be combined with would be wind blowing consistently towards the major centers of population. And that was, in a sense, our reasonable worst case. But it would be possible to actually even go beyond that and say the very worst case, or the enhanced worst case, might consist as follows. First of all, once one of the reactors had meltdown, it might have produced sufficient nuclear material to mean that it would be unsafe to work on the plant. And in such a case, it would be very hard to see how the other two, and there were 3 reactors that potentially could have gone into meltdown, how they would behave without any human interaction. And so it was possible to actually think about a really extreme worst case to occur, in which there would be a cascade of meltdowns and pond failures and fires. So we were able to think about both this reasonable worst case, i.e. a single reactor and a single pond, but also looking at the extremely pessimistic view of all reactors go into meltdown, all of them go into an explosive meltdown, and all the ponds catch fire and put nuclear material into the atmosphere. And so one of the key things that we had to do then was make the calculation of what that would appear like if that happened. And to cut a long story short, in the first case, 1 reactor and 1 pond, we found that in Tokyo, even with the worst combination of weather, there would be a few small numbers of millisieverts. Now, 2 or 3 millisieverts, and you'll all be familiar with that, and I'll get on to the comparison because that's quite important later on. But we also did a calculation of saying, in this extreme worst case, the terrible series of cascading reactors going into meltdown and ponds burning, what would that be the case with, again, this combination of weather, meaning that it constantly in the direction of Tokyo. This one is a really unlikely case, but we took it on and we did the calculation and we came up with maybe between 15 and 30 millisieverts in Tokyo. Very important, because in neither of these situations was it sensible to advise the UK government that they should evacuate our nationals and suggest our embassy to move. Nowhere near. Indeed, even in this very, very extreme worst case scenario, the analysis indicated that the level of radiation that might follow a plume, and that plume would have to be a combination of all these reactors going up at the same time, even in that case, simple mechanisms of shelter, of people going inside and staying inside their buildings as the plume passed over, and providing stable iodine to small children and nursing mothers would be quite sufficient. No need to evacuate, no need to be concerned about UK nationals leaving Tokyo or being told not to come. So it was a very clear-cut result. And I should emphasize that the extreme worst case just seemed so unlikely to happen, but nevertheless, for reassurance, we sought to do it. Now, obviously, we were thinking about Tokyo, and we were also thinking about how the weather changes, and that at any time, let's say the reasonable worst case, a single reactor might go into meltdown and a pond start to burn. So what we did was we coupled our analyses of the explosions that might occur on the plant together with what was the weather at one time. And we did this on a 4 or 5 times a day, looking at the weather for the next few hours, so that if something happened, we would be in a position to predict what would be the effective dose that you might have in this case. So we produced maps that look rather like this. This is indicating the sort of problems that we're having. And we also calculated what the effective dose is likely to be at the 10 and the 20, the 30 kilometer, and also at some of the centers of population, including Tokyo, but also Hitachi, Sendai, and Niigata, and Nagano. And that was produced by our SAGE team, as I say, 5 or 6 times a day. So in that way, we were able to indicate, both as an early warning to some of those cities and towns nearer to Fukushima, what the likely effect would be in the worst case. Because remember, we were in ignorance. We had no way, in the chaos that was occurring, of actually getting detailed data of what was actually happening. And we weren't trying to do that. We were saying, what is the worst that can happen? And that's very different. And so we were able to say, even in the worst case, this is the sort of thing that will happen in the next 4 or 5 hours with the weather. Now, it's all very well to do that and to convince your colleagues, and we were able to convince the Prime Minister and the COBRA committee that the advice for our embassy to put out was that our nationals had no need to evacuate. The embassy would certainly not move and would remain in Tokyo. But it's important to actually understand that people have this tremendous fear and concerns, and there had been a lot of confusing advice coming out both from media and some individual scientists speculating in some degree of ignorance. So one of the things at the suggestion of our embassy I did, and I think with retrospect that was extremely important, was that I gave a series of telephone calls which people could phone in on. I gave a view of what we thought was the situation. I explained what I've just explained to you about what the reasonable and the extreme worst cases were, and the giving out the message that even in these situations, there was really no call for major worry. But of course, people will worry, and so part of that telephone conversation was to actually answer questions that people would want to pose to us, because I think it's really important that the general public can challenge scientists. They can ask questions and they don't have to worry about whether those questions seem rather oversimplistic. And of course, as is always the case in emergencies, sometimes information came in. So there was a short period when it was found that radioactive iodine had contaminated one of the major water suppliers into Tokyo. It was a transitory phenomenon, and indeed, I still don't know how it could have happened. It may not indeed have been traced to Fukushima, but of course that was a problem. And I remember one of the questions that I was asked in the conversation that I had with families, mothers, and the school teachers was, should I bath my children in bottled water? And of course the answer you can say unequivocally, don't worry. You know, the levels of radiation are very small. And so I think that was very important. But also, we put it up on the website so it could be challenged by anyone in the United Kingdom, the sort of advice that we had given, namely not to evacuate and not to tell our nationals to leave. But we have to realize that there's a real problem. So what does it mean when we say that there would be something like 3 millisieverts on the streets of Tokyo for a short period of time when the plume passed over? We have to put these things in context. And for example, to 2 microsieverts, which is a sort of typical dose that you might get if you visited the area at the moment, is something like a 20th of what you would get from flying to New York and back. And one of my staff has put up a banana to indicate how many bananas you would have to eat in order to get the same dosage that might occur if you'd stayed in Tokyo. It's a slightly facetious way of showing it, but I do think it puts these things into perspective. And of course, this is not to say that radiation is not dangerous. Of course it can be. But again, if we think about the levels of radiation, you have got to go down to very high levels where you get severe radiation poisoning, around about 2000. And in terms of danger, smoking 1.5 packs of cigarettes a day is massively more dangerous. And the sort of level that we might see are such that really, the general advice that we were able to give is this is not a thing to worry about. So that was the first question. But obviously, there are lessons to be learned from what has actually happened. And one of the lessons we've got to ask about is where we build our nuclear plants and how we build them and how we can build them. And this is a picture of, it's called a heat wave map, which shows the amount of earthquakes since 1973 worldwide. So red means a lot of earthquakes, yellow means not so many, and anything that's blue means that you effectively don't have earthquakes in that area. And the blue points there are the siting of nuclear power stations. And of course, there is an area of concern around Japan and parts of China. And there's also an area of concern because there is a coexistence of some potentially frequent earthquakes where nuclear power plants have been built. So there are lessons to be learned about that in terms of how one looks at safety systems. For example, the biggest problem that we've seen was initially in Fukushima Daiichi was that the power system failed. If it hadn't failed, there would have been significantly less problem. And the neighboring power station managed to re-establish power. Daiichi was not so fortunate. So there are proper things to ask. And Dr. Waitman has just been visiting. He's been visiting with a team from the UN, Fukushima, and he would in due course report on these issues, and there will be discussions with the Japanese authorities. But that is the rational response, but also I'm afraid there have been irrational responses. For example, in the European Union, the completely sensible scientific advice on the radioactive composition of food was changed, not on the basis of scientific advice which didn't change, but was changed down with a tightening on the radiation limits on Japanese food, a completely non-evidence-based decision. So we need to be thinking about how we deal with that and how we deal with evidence. And next thing is that it's quite important but obviously there's a need to reassure public opinion, and the Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change asked the same Dr. Waitman to assess what the implications of Fukushima were for the UK and UK's planned nuclear build. And one of the, he asked the Office of Nuclear Regulation, led by Dr. Waitman, and historically it's provided very detailed advice on all of our nuclear plants, and the small table, which is too complicated, I think, to go through in this audience, this small table indicates the sort of assessment the UK does on the basis potential of seismic activity and flooding for our UK reactor sites, and how we use historical data to make safety cases and think about the design of reactors in a very different part of the world from Japan, but in which we have different problems, potential flooding, surges from the North Sea and other issues. And he reported in about 10 days ago on the conclusions of the Fukushima for the UK new build. He pointed out there was no reason to curtail the operation of nuclear plants. There was no reason to, for the nuclear power industry had reacted responsibly. There were no significant weaknesses in our licensing position. Flooding risks were unlikely to prevent construction, and there was no reason to change our present siting strategies. Now, that doesn't mean to say the same answers will apply elsewhere in the world, but it also meant that some of our new designs were working extremely well. And the European Union and the European Commission is thinking about other things to do with stress tests for nuclear plant, and all of this is perfectly proper. We have got to learn lessons from the dreadful tragedy that's actually happened in Japan, and we need to be thinking how we learn those lessons. And public opinion is interesting because it does not seem that public opinion, at least in the United Kingdom, has much changed. People have not dramatically changed their attitude to the disaster, despite on occasion quite dramatic media reporting. But the basic recognition is that if we are to look at a reasonably costed energy program, and if we are to be addressing what is a massive problem of climate change and the need to reduce greenhouse gases, we need to recognize that that nuclear is there. And by and large, albeit public opinion has changed somewhat, it's not changed in anything like a dramatic way. And the headline from the Financial Times saying Fukushima fails to dent UK nuclear support, I think sums it up. But I think that it really is rather important that science and engineering and scientists and engineers are not too arrogant. We can get it wrong. And there's a wonderful Japanese proverb, which I thought was on here and isn't, and so I'm sorry, I don't have that proverb. Somebody's decided to delete it. But actually, that, and I don't know who was that, whether that's censorship by GRIP, or, but I can tell you what that proverb is, and I will try it in Japanese. It's Saru mo ki kara ochiro. And that is what I wanted to put on the screen, but I've been censored. But of course, for the English people, it's even monkeys fall from trees. Experts can be wrong, and we've got to be prepared to have a system that experts can be challenged, and we should not slavishly follow the advice of experts, but we have got to make certain that the process in which scientific advice comes in a way in which can be challenged. And that's why I think the mechanism that we have in the United Kingdom with our science advisory group in emergencies, the SAGE, which is publishing its results, which are there for challenge, is so important. But I think it is continually one of uncertainty. And this is a quotation which has not been censored because it's from Cicero, and it says that probabilities direct the conduct of the wise man. There is no certainty, and I believe Cicero writing before the birth of Christ, I think he would have probably said now, man and women. So thank you very much for your attention.
ありがとうございました。Thank you very much. 同時通訳の機械をつけるまでちょっとお待ちくださいということです。いろいろ聞いて、ご質問になりたいことあると思います。挙手をお願いすることになりますが、その前に、私の方からもちょっと、質問しておこうと思います。先ほどは日本の科学者や専門家を猿に例えていただいてありがとうございました。この英国政府首席科学顧問という制度はいつ頃何をきっかけで生まれたんでしょうか。
There's been a chief scientific advisor since the end of the Second World War, when Churchill had a chief scientific advisor. And there's been a chief scientific advisor every year since for successive prime ministers. The difference between ourselves and the USA, where there also is a chief scientific advisor, the similar person to myself is a man called John Holdren, who was appointed by President Obama. But that is a political appointment, so when the presidency changes, the chief scientific advisor also changes. In my case, when there was a change of government in May last year, I was originally working for Gordon Brown as Prime Minister. I'm now working for David Cameron. So that's the difference. I think the other difference, which I would say is really important, is that the recognition that we need scientific advice in emergencies has come relatively late. I became Chief Scientific Advisor in January 2008, and the first emergency that I had to deal with was in April 2009, when we had the swine flu outbreak. And then in April 2010, we had the problem of volcanic ash closing airspace in Northern Europe. And I was waiting for April 2011, but March 2011, we had the Fukushima problem, and in fact we've had another volcanic ash problem. So that's only been going for 3 years.
わかりました。そういうお立場だそうであります。それでは会場からのご質問をお受けしますが、まずは政策研究大学院大学の黒川教授からコメント、質問といいますかコメントがあるということですのでお受けいたしましょう。はい、どうぞ。
日本語で喋るからよろしいですか。Would you put on this translator ね。これが起きたときに、これはイミディエットリーに世界のインプリケーションがあったわけですね。特にニュークリアの場合は、これからたくさんニュークリアプラントを作ろうという人たちもいたわけなので、私がすぐにコミュニケーションを始めたのは、私もサイエンスアドバイザーって2年やらせていただきましたけど、そういうのは日本には存在してなかったから、ほとんど誰も聞かないっていう話になるわけですよ。役所がコントロールしてますからね。だからそれで、こういう人たちとしょっちゅうやってたんですけど、その時にこういうグローバルなイシューは誰でも事故は起こしたくないわけですよ。だけどこれから100台ぐらいニュークリアを作ろうっていうのがトレンドでしたから、これをすぐに公開して「Lesson to be learned and share for the world」っていう話をずっとやってたんですね。それで向こうのニュークリアレギュレートコミッションとかナショナルアカデミーの人たちとすぐに E メールとか電話をしながらずっとやってて、ぜひそのインディペンデントなガバメントからね、インディペンデントなインターナショナルなタスクフォースを作りなさいっていうことを何度も言ってたんですけど、まだまだそのプロセスが今動いているところだと思います。これはポリティカルなディシジョンで、いくらこういう制度を入れていても、政治のトップがそれをどう使うかという意思が一番大事なんですね。で、今度の事件で明らかに分かったのは、世界的なイシューで津波もすごかったけど、ニュークリアになったので、世界中が日本のメディアを見ました。それでそれがすぐに訳されていきます、世界中に。というわけで、日本の政府の対応がクエスチョナブルかなというのが一つ。二つ目は、エナジーカンパニーのプレスリリースがクエスチョナブルだなと。3番目はジャーナリズムがみんな同じこと言ってるなと、最初の2週間で。みんな知ってる人は記者クラブの問題ってすぐ分かるわけですね。だから4番目には専門家という人がみんな出てくるのが、政府の見解以上には言わないということはもう明らかに分かっちゃったんですね。それで風評もありましたけども、全ての日本のエスタブリッシュメントの信用が今メルトダウンを起こしている。それをどうやって回復するかというのがすごく大事で、第三者評価機構をやるのはそれは国として当然のことです。だけどこういう世界的なイシューはヘルプもそうだけど、アナリシス、次のポリシーも今言ったようなグローバルなアウトサイドのインディペンデントのタスクフォースを作らない限り、それがまず第一歩として信用のメルトダウンを防ぐということですごく大事なことだと思っています。そういう意味でぜひイギリスでもですね、昔BSE の話がありましたね。あれは世界的な意味があるわけですよ、どんどん移っていくから。であれが日本にも起こりそうだっていう話はもう分かっていたんだけど、BSE が1986年に最初にシープからビーフにやった時に、
キャトルにあった時にイギリスのサイエンスコミュニティというのは極めて国民から信頼されています。いろんなことがあるけど。だけどそれをイギリスのサイエンティストのアドバイザーに従って人間には移らないよという政府がスタンスを取ったので仕方がないんだけど、その後人間から患者さんが出ました。これで信用を回復するのにまず10年経って EU に全く中立の国際的なエキスパートのパネルを作りました。でそれに従ってその可能性があるというふうにイギリスの政府は言ったんだけど、その後イギリスの畜産業が世界で信用されるのはもう10年かかりました。つまり最初の初動で20年かかるんですね、1回落ちた信頼は。だからそういうのが今の日本の状況だと思うので、ぜひインディペンデントなインターナショナルなタスクフォースを作らないと、日本が何を言っても信じられないところに来てるんじゃないかと思いますが、いかがでしょうか。
そういう問題提起がありました。まずその点に関していかがでしょうか。
I don't think it's appropriate for me to comment on whether my host country here is trusted or not. I think that would be exceeding the realms of my job of providing scientific advice. But I can focus on what were quite severe mistakes that were made in the United Kingdom on BSE, in which essentially the scientific advice was ignored. And I think that the lessons that were learned at that time were taken on board by a series of governments. And I wouldn't single out one government as doing it. So first of all, that the government recognised that they did need to have something authoritative that was challenged and challengeable. And I think I've emphasised in my talk that I think one of the key things is that one has got to have not just government scientists providing advice, but you have independent people from universities or from industry, and that's appropriate. In terms of an international panel, I don't think it's appropriate for me to comment, but I think that there is quite clearly a very diverse set of views based on a very diverse basis. Some of it is scientific, some of it is engineering, some of it is moral, some of it is philosophical almost. And I think that an assessment of nuclear safety with an international assessment would, I'm sure, be of value. And I think the group that Dr. Waitman has led to Japan, which will be reporting objectively, and this group comes from some 20 different countries around the world. I think that group will form a basis for examining what the implications are from Fukushima. And I know that a number of organizations, I know in the European community, there's going to be some discussions about what might be appropriate rules for regulating safety. But I think that there are some general things, is that this should be done on the basis of objective engineering and scientific assessment. And I think that there's a journalist in the United Kingdom who is normally rather anti-government. And he wrote a piece and said that even in the worst possible scenario, which was the Fukushima disaster, with an old nuclear reactor, which is not ideally designed for an area where earthquakes and tsunamis can happen. Even that, he said, well, it is important to realize that nobody's died. And I think that when you compare this and contrast it with the tragic death of tens of thousands of Japanese from the tsunami, I think it does put these things in perspective. And that is a view, that's not a scientific view, I'm quoting a journalist, but it's a journalist at the time. I was surprised to have made that point. So I think it is important that when we are dealing with scientific and engineering issues, and that has implications for the way that the country decisions which operate at a political level, that they are seen to be as independent as possible. Thank you.
わかりました。はい。では、ご質問、じゃあその女性の方いきましょうか。マイクが回りますから、所属とお名前を明らかにしてからお願いします。
参議院議員の川口頼子と申します。大変に面白いお話をありがとうございました。質問は、その政治が決めた判断、これについてその政治が アクセプトする場合もあれば、受け入れない場合もあると思いますけれども、政治がそれを受け入れる、受け入れないのいかんを問わず、政治はあるいはベディントンさんはその結果を国民に直接伝えるということが許されているのかどうかということをお伺いをしたいと思います。
Thank you for the question. I think that the first thing is that in decisions, scientific advice is not the only advice. There will be financial, there will be ethical, and there will be political things. And I think that but the key point, and indeed we are allowed to communicate, the minutes of the SAGE meeting go public and are available for the general public to look. After some delay, a slight delay, but after a delay they were there. And that was a recommendation of the parliamentary subcommittee which reported late last year. What has been the practice, and I've been the only chair of SAGE, has been that we have always communicated what the advice was, and by and large our government has actually taken that advice. I think there has been occasion where SAGE itself has not agreed, that there is not a consensus within the SAGE group, and scientists are quarrelsome people. They don't always agree with each other, and they are quite skeptical about people's opinions. So there was one case, I remember, in this case of the swine flu advice we gave, that there was no unanimity. There were two views. And I think in that situation it's important to recognise that, albeit there may be two views, there may be one that is arguably a little more well-balanced or overwhelming. And I think that's the case that we see occurring quite often. And I think one of the situations that I am concerned about, not in this context of SAGE, where we're able to say there are two views, both are completely reasonable, but I think the balance of evidence is on this one, and that was in a sense my judgment as chairman. But I did actually pose to the SAGE committee, and I said, there are two views here. My belief is that the balance of evidence is in the case of this one. Do you disagree? And people didn't. So I think that was my defence as chairman if people had challenged that view. I think there's a wider question about this, which is that there is definitely a tendency that the media likes to treat some scientific disputes or discussions as if it's a football match. On the one side, we have this group of scientists, on the other, this group. But very often, and for example, in the case of climate change, the community that has looked at climate change as an issue is overwhelmingly believing that climate change is happening and it's induced by human activity. There are a few, and compared to that overwhelming community, who disagree, and yet on occasion you will see the media say on the one side we have people who think that climate change happens, on the other side people who don't. And it's almost seen as an equal view. There is one is enormously supported by very, very large numbers of people in much analysis, and the other is not. And I think that's a dangerous situation for us. It doesn't mean to say that we can't have skepticism, because science grows it. As I've just said, scientists are quarrelsome people. They will disagree with each other whenever they get the opportunity. But I think the overwhelming consensus has got to be communicated, and I think the media can be very helpful in doing that. Not that it stops dissent, but science grows by skepticism, but where you have a situation where an overwhelming consensus exists on the science, then it's unhelpful if it's appeared to be there are major differences.
わかりました。今に追加の質問をいたします。そのように政治が政府に助言をした、それについては後ほど議事録で公開されるというお話でしたが、助言したときに直ちに記者会見を開いて、メディアを通じて国民に対してこういう助言をしましたよという発表はしていらっしゃるんでしょうか、していないんでしょうか。
It depends. After we'd had been looking at this latest situation, I did give a press conference, and I was interviewed on the TV, and we indicated the burden of the advice and the concerns that we'd actually passed to government at that time. In the case of swine flu. This was an ongoing operation. The swine flu epidemic lasted sort of something like 5 or 6 months. And in that case, we agreed that the chief medical officer of the UK, who was part of the scientific advice team, provided the press conferences. And I think that, the situation will vary. But I think the general aim is that what SAGE has advised goes out and becomes available, except in situations where there can be quite sensitive issues in terms of time, and I think that that's appropriate. But the basic plan always to publish the minutes of SAGE, even if it comes with some delay, seems to me to be the right way forward. And what we did in this case was minutes take a little while to write, so we put up a summary of what our conclusions were on our website very soon after the meeting concluded.
わかりました。はい。ではどうぞ。
Richard Lloyd Parry of the Times. You're very discreet in declining to comment on the trustworthiness of your hosts, but I would have thought that is a very important part of your job, because the data which is coming out of Japan is surely the basis on which you make your judgment and give advice to the government. This came up. So could you therefore give us your assessment of the reliability of the information coming out of Japan? Do you think we're getting the whole picture? This came up recently, in particular with TEPCO, when, as you know, they announced just in the last 2 or 3 weeks that there had been a fairly substantial meltdown in the first 3 reactors, and that was information which you didn't have when you first made your assessment. On that particular case, are you surprised it took them so long to make that announcement? And are you persuaded by their contention that they simply didn't have the data to make that judgment earlier?
There were 11 questions in that particular speech, and I won't choose them selectively.
Well, if there's just one central one, do you trust the data?
I think you've misunderstood the point that I was making during my speech. In the calculations that we were answering the question, should we get the embassy and British nationals to leave, we were looking at what would be a worst possible case. So the fact that there was a partial meltdown in Reactor 1, which we learned only quite recently, as you've pointed out in your statement, did not change our advice one iota, because the basis of providing that advice was asking reasonable questions about what would be a worst case scenario. Now, so that is one of the reasons why it was in the early stages when we were having to provide that advice, and when the advice was coming through sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, we were able nevertheless to give appropriate advice to the government and to our embassy and to our nationals in the UK. Now, I really am not going to be prepared to discuss whether in fact things should be quicker, things should be slower. I'm not in possession of the detailed reasons for it. It is a very, very dramatic event that occurred, and a great deal of chaos and a great deal of courage that some of the workers have put in to actually try to address this. So I don't think it's appropriate for me to comment from afar when I'm not actually involved in that. The question you asked, which it is appropriate for me to comment on, is would extra information and more timely information have changed our advice? And I think the answer to that is quite clearly no.
時間の都合がありますので、会場からはあともう一人だけ、じゃあ後ろその3段目の方お願いします。
もう一人政治家になりますが、参議院の大野でございます。小野元弘でございます。一つぜひお伺いをしたいのは、今回のようなケースを日本に当てはめて考えると、通常日本では委員会のようなものができると、専門家が集められて政治家が諮問をいたします。それに対する答申という形で、聞かれたことに対する返答という形になりますが、例えば安全保障などでは建議という、要するに専門家側からこういったことをぜひした方がいいという能力がありますけれども、イギリスの場合には 科学者側がイニシアチブを取ってそういったプロポーザルをできるのか、それとも政府の側から言われたことに対して科学者の知見が求められるのか、どちらなんでしょうか。あるいはその権限ができるとすればその効力、実際にそのどういった効用があるかについて教えていただきたいと思います。
An interesting question, and I think the answer is that it depends. In the case of emergencies, which we've been just discussing, when an emergency happens and the government asks me to convene a SAGE and provide advice, that is at the government's request, of course. I think it's highly unlikely you would have an emergency in which I was concerned, and but if I was, I would raise that with government. For example, I mentioned in passing real concerns about the potential harm in the next 2 years of changing in the sun's activity, so that we could actually have quite severe electromagnetic storms and other solar emissions. And I've both discussed it, raised it with the Prime Minister, and in fact the Prime Minister and President Obama, when they met in London last week, actually issued a communique to indicate that this was now being taken seriously, and that there was going to be enhanced cooperation between the US and the UK on this particular issue of space weather. That's just one example. So we can be challenging, we can say things are going wrong, we can say we are very worried about a particular problem as government chief scientific advisors. And I think that is really rather important, because I think the committee of experts, which in a sense the jargon is speak when spoken to, is not the way to actually challenge issues and raise them. But the politicians do have the chance to quiz the scientists, because again we have the problem that even monkeys fall from trees. And so when SAGE provides its advice to COBRA, then you're challenged. So, for example, both Dr. Waitman and I attended the COBRA meeting where we were indicating our advice that there was no need for the embassy to move or our nationals to leave the country or not come. And that was challenged. You know, people were saying, "Are you sure? Are you sure this is really is the worst case? Could something worse happen?" So there is the point. There is the opportunity to quiz the scientific advice at that time.
はい、ありがとうございました。続いてツイッターからの、質問を読み上げます。ツイッターネーム奥田さんという方からですが、数年内に地球上の原発は500基にも上るとされています。今後の原発の安全操業において留意すべき点、それから不測の事態が起きた時の安全基準、あるいは留意すべき指針を教えてくださいという質問です。
I couldn't answer that myself, because because that's quite a lot of power plants and quite a lot of different geographical areas. But I think in general it is absolutely clear that there are lessons to be learned from Fukushima, that we are going to need to think very carefully about what the safety designs are of nuclear power plants, depending on the geography in the areas that have actually been put down. And we have got to recognise that that is going to be a subject of considerable technical discussion. The new generation of reactors that have actually been built in the UK have significantly enhanced safety factors, but that is not necessarily enough. And as you saw from my comments on Professor Mike Waitman's recommendations to the UK government, he is suggesting enhanced safety cases and enhanced investigation. And I think that the group that he's been leading here from the international community will make a report which will propose these things. And I think there will be international meetings, there will be discussions about what is the appropriate safety cases, and that seems to me to be entirely proper.
続いてツイッターネームウルトさんですかね、これ、本日ですが、ドイツが2022年までに原子力発電から脱却することで合意しましたが、原子力の今後のロードマップについて意見があれば教えてくださいとのことです。
Well, I note the decision by the German government, which is a democratic process. I don't think that I'm aware of any safety cases that would be the evidence on which that would be based, but I think, as I said, there are political, economic and philosophical views about which are involved as well. In terms of the UK plans, we are looking at a new generation of nuclear power plants, which I think the first one is intended to be built by 2017. It will be about, I think in total there'll be about 16 gigawatt capacity, and that's, I think, the number of plants. There's 8, though I would have to actually check that. The recommendation by Mike Waitman to government, which was in an interim report in May and will be finalised later in the year, probably by September, basically says there's absolutely no need, on the basis of the lessons learned from Fukushima, to change that, to move away from our plans to actually develop nuclear power within the United Kingdom. And I think the context I really would like to put this in is that there is an enormous problem of climate change. There is an enormous problem of actually providing energy in a way that does not involve the use of fossil fuels and the production of greenhouse gases. There's been, as we all know, a series of international meetings in which various countries have actually, after the meetings, have pledged to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. The UK, for example, is pledged to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050 and by 34% by 2020. This is the UK law. It's with support from both the government and the opposition. So how can we do that? How can we do that in a way that does not involve enormous increases in the cost of electricity for the consumers? I believe, and all the analysis that I've ever seen of this question points towards the need for nuclear power to be a significant part of UK energy supplies.
もう時間がありませんので、最後の質問、やっぱりツイッターネームシープチェイスさん、英語での質問が来ています。複数の科学者が異なる客観的アドバイスを提示した場合、政府はどのようにして国民の不安を払拭できるんですかという質問です。
I have slightly answered that in the context that I do think we need to be recognizing that there can be genuine uncertainty, and if there is a genuine uncertainty on the science, it's the responsibility of people like myself to say there's a genuine uncertainty. But that if you have a situation where there is a consensus of the scientific advice in one direction, and there are one or two people who are querying that consensus, I think that one has got to provide that advice and saying the balance of evidence and the balance of scientific opinion is in that direction. But you should never be in a situation where you pretend there is consensus when there's not, and I think that's the only way that we can actually do it. So the question I would say is if there has been some scientific query about a particular thing, can one examine it? Can one look at it from a rational point of view? And it may be a good idea. It may be actually turn out to be correct. The path of science has been when very, very good scientists have challenged the consensus, and and that's the way science grows. So the fact that you get challenge is a good thing. I think where you get challenge which is not necessarily has a good foundation in evidence. So I think the question we have to ask is, if there's a different opinion from individuals or a set of individuals, what is the basis for it? Is it robust to criticism? What is the evidence they adduce? And things of this sort. So just as one would expect in consensus to be challenged, in the same way dissent should be challenged as well.
わかりました。ありがとうございました。まだまだお話をお伺いしたいんですが、時間をだいぶオーバーしました。で、この後はですね、日本側の参加者、パネリストも交えて、改めてこれからの科学者、あるいは政治行政マスコミが何をすべきかということを議論していこうと思います。今からステージを準備をいたしますので、5分ほどお時間をいただきます。ありがとうございました。